Now that we're all done talking about PvP and everything around it, I think it's time to go back to a couple of normal videos that I still had planned. One of them is an update to the best weapons video that I made before the update, because the Tidal Basin patch came with a couple of damage buffs and a couple of damage nerfs to a few weapons. For example, the Model 700 has received a nerf, as well as the MK17 rifle. They both got hit with about a 14% damage reduction. Then we have the Lightweight M4, which has gotten a 5% damage buff and a 50% RPM increase. The LVOA has received a 58% RPM increase. The AA shotgun received a buff. The MG5 got a buff and got its reversed optimal range fixed. And no, and that's actually it. That's the whole list right there. Those are the weapon changes that came with Tidal Basin. And I guess even though it's not as much, I thought it would be worth updating that video, so you know what weapons are the best and that kind of stuff. Oh, and I also wanted to clear some things up that were a little bit confusing with the last video, I guess, because I got a lot of comments about a lot of things. So yeah, let's start off with the reload times on the weapons, actually, because as some of you may have noticed, the reload times on my graph for some weapons are not exactly the same as that they are in game. Not all of them, but some of them. And one example would be with the G36. Without any reload buffs, it says that my G36 in-game has a 2.2 second reload time, but then on the graph it says 2.0 seconds. So, you know, obviously there's something wrong with the graph, right? Well, yeah and no. You see, something that I recently figured out is that reload times differ when you reload from empty than if you were to reload halfway through the magazine. If you, for example, reload the G36 from empty, the reload time will be 2.2 seconds. But if you reload it anywhere else in the magazine, so maybe when it has 1 bullet left or when it still has 15 bullets left, the reload time is only 2 seconds, the one that you can see in the graph. So that's where the differences come from. Now, in the graph that we use for this video, we do try to portray a weapon that's being fired continuously all the way until the magazine is empty, and then reload the weapon for a so-called perfect representation. So if you look at it that way, yeah, it should have a 2.2 second reload time, but here's also the thing. A graph like this also cannot possibly represent accurately how much damage a weapon deals perfectly over time, because it doesn't take any weapon mods into account, any bonuses to stat rolls or critical hits or headshots or pauses that you have to have in between shooting. And I feel like that when I'm playing myself, I usually reload not from empty. I usually reload with a couple bullets in the magazine, because I reload at the times when an NPC just died and I know that I don't have enough bullets to kill another NPC. I do that with almost every weapon class except for with SMGs. I usually fire those until they're all the way empty. And then you have also bolt action snipers, which work a little bit different. So honestly, I've been thinking about what reload time I should put here, and I just don't really know. You know, should I put the reload time from empty to keep the graph exactly 1-to-1, as you would see in game when you would fire a magazine completely empty? Or do we go for the normal reload time, which is the one that players will most likely use more often, but then doesn't always 100% accurately display the sustained damage in game, I guess. It's be damned if you do, be damned if you don't situation, because neither case is really going to show you exactly what your sustained damage will be. So yeah, for this video, I decided to go with still the old reload times, the ones that apply when you don't reload the magazine from empty. And that means that in some cases, there's going to be a 0.2 or 0.1 second difference between the reload time in-game and the reload time that the weapon has on this graph. And if you think I should do it differently, that I should use the reload time from empty, just let me know in the comments. I'll look at it and then I can do that for the next video. It's no big deal. I didn't know which one to pick, and I went with the same one as I did last graph, just to keep things from getting too complicated. So yeah, with all of that out of the way, I think it's time to look at the graphs. For assault rifles, nothing changed because no assault rifles got buffed or nerfed. However, I did quickly want to point out that the AK-M, the red line, is actually an assault rifle, guys. I had a lot of comments last video of people saying that the AK-M is a rifle, referring to the rootless or the merciless exotic weapons that are based on the AK-M model, which is AK-M without a dash, which I also have that weapon in my rifle overview, as you can see here in yellow. But no, that's not a mistake. The AK-M is actually an assault rifle. You can even craft one if you have the blueprint. But to make it less confusing, I'll be changing the AK-M without a dash in the rifle category. I'll be changing that to rootless to match the exotic names. Merciless is also the exact same weapon as the rootless, by the way, the same damage scaling. So if you want to know what the merciless can do, just look at the rootless. So yeah, now that we're looking at the rifle class anyway, we might as well fill in the changes. First up, we have the MK17 nerf. This weapon got hit with a 14% nerf to its damage, which means that it ends up sitting right here in the graph, with its burst damage falling just short of the burst damage that the MDR has, and just above of what the ACR can do. However, in sustained damage, I think even with this nerf, it is still the best rifle to go for. And it's also a lot easier to achieve this sustained damage compared to some other rifles because of the lower RPM that this rifle has, which means it's far easier to spam at its max fire rate, and thus I still think it's a really good weapon. So was this nerf fair? Yeah, I think it was. I know that not everybody's happy with it, but the MK17 jumped out far and above all the other rifles, and right now it sits in a very good place where it's still strong, but not too strong. Then we get to the M4, and the M4 received a 5% damage buff and a 50% RPM buff. So if we add that into our graph, we'll see that the DPS of this thing now skyrockets to 127,000. And keep in mind, these are still the World Tier 4 values, but everything in World Tier 5 is relatively the same, so no need to worry about that. But yeah, it jumps to 127,000 DPS, which doesn't make it the best weapon for burst, but damn, it is pretty competitive for sustained damage, even with the MK17 now. If you can keep up with the faster RPM, that is, because this weapon does have a fairly high RPM compared to the MK17. The LVOA had its stats separated from the M4. It didn't receive the same 5% damage boost, but it got a 58% RPM increase in stats. So we have to make another graph for the LVOA, which means that it's going to look something like this. And this, in my opinion, just ends up being a tiny bit worse than the M4 variant, because it has a higher RPM, but also a lower base damage. And because those two are combined, they basically end up doing the exact same burst DPS. But because it does have a higher RPM, that also means that the magazine is empty just a little bit faster, which then means that it doesn't have as much sustained damage as the M4 does. But yeah, that's it for rifles though. The M1A continues to be handicapped by its super low magazine size and long reload time. The Rootless still has a low base damage due to its exotic talent, and the M16 and 1886 are, still not the greatest weapons when it comes to DPS. Moving over to the SMGs, we had no changes with the SMGs, but I heard your feedback with last video, and therefore I also wanted to include the 9mm versions of the Vectors, both of them, the tactical and the non-tactical version, because many of you have asked why I only included the 45 ACP Vector. And that's because, well, out of all the vectors, I found that this was the best vector, and I didn't want to include the two other ones because, this graph already looks so messy with so many SMGs in the game. But yeah, I decided to just take away some of the medium performing or underperforming SMGs and include the 9mm vectors here so you can see how they do. So first up, the tactical vector, which has by far the most burst damage of any SMG, but due to its very high RPM and extremely small magazine size, it also has one of the lowest sustained damage outputs of any SMG out there. And then for the normal 9mm vector, which is also pretty good for burst, it has a tiny bit more burst than the T821, but this version is held back by its longer than normal reload time, which then also makes the weapon pretty bad in the sustained damage department. And again, if we compare the lines, this is why for the previous video I only did the 45 ACP vector, because I found it to be the overall best performing. But then again, we're also looking at weapons without magazines, so maybe I should have included it. Anyway, it's included now, so here you go. Moving over to the LMGs, the MG5 has received a 12% buff to its base damage, which puts it right here on the graph. It's actually the LMG with the highest burst damage in the game now, and do not forget that the MG5 also has more headshot damage than all the other LMGs. So this one has 85% headshot damage, whereas the other LMGs only have 65%. The downside of the MG5 is still that it has a very lengthy reload time, which makes it so that if I want to run an LMG with something like Frenzy, I'd still recommend going for the L86 or the RPK because of the lower reload times that those weapons have. And no, before you ask, I'm not putting the Pestilence on this graph because the Pestilence base damage is extremely low, and it fully relies on its special talent to do anything, but the weapon is not too great either, so yeah. But yeah, this graph is not looking at talents, so it's kind of pointless to put it on there because it wouldn't show its true performance. Moving over to Shotgun, the AA12 got a 16% damage increase, boosting that one up pretty high on the graph, giving it more burst than any shotgun in the game, apart from, of course, the double barrel, and allowing it to keep up with other weapons in the sustained damage department as well. Honestly, even though on sustained damage and for burst damage, this weapon is neither the best, but this would still probably be my go-to shotgun now, because it's also automatic, which means that it's guaranteed that you're always shooting at max RPM, and it's just a whole lot easier to use. So why not? Then we get to snipers. For the sniper class, we see a 13% nerf to the Model 700, making it, on paper, appear weaker. But while that might be the case, it is still the sniper with the highest single bullet damage in the game, which allows it to one-shot players even after this nerf, especially in the occupied DC, although this time you need a little more of a min-maxed build. You need some special talents, you need to use the scope, and in normalization, if a player is very, very tanky, he should be able to tank one bullet without dying. So yeah, one shot's still possible, but it's just not as bad as it used to be anymore. Pistols still remain the same as well, no changes there. So yeah, that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. My recommendations for each weapon type are now still the P416 for sustain and burst on the assault rifles. I guess we could recommend the Vector 9mm for burst if you really want burst. But for sustain and just overall damage, I'd still recommend the T821. For rifles, it's actually really close, but for both sustain and burst, I would still recommend the MK17 simply because it has higher burst, a slightly higher burst than the M4, and a far lower RPM, which means that shooting it at the max RPM is easier, and thus it's going to be more consistent on whether you get the actual sustain damage that you see on the graph here. For LMGs, the MG5 is pretty good for burst, and then the M60 is good for sustain, but as I said, with LMGs, you're probably going to want to pick up the Frenzy talent, and the Frenzy talent just so happens to be really good with the L86 or the RPK. So even though it doesn't show up on the chart, I would probably pick those LMGs if you play with that specific talent. Nothing has really changed with the shotguns, technically. As I said, you know, the double barrel is still the highest burst shotgun, and the Spaz is still the best for sustain. However, a good middle ground is still going to be the AA12 because it does both pretty well, and it's automatic. And then for snipers, honestly, nothing changed. Model 700, best single bullet sniper in the game, and the SVD is still the best for sustained damage. And even though I never play with pistol, I'll put them here again. I guess the M1911 for burst and the PX4 for sustain. And that's honestly all. That's the whole video. So yeah, as always, guys, I'll see you all later. Or, like they say in the Netherlands, zie je later.